I would like to take the opportunity given by this opening keynote session to welcome you all here at the Institut d'études européennes of the Université Libre de Bruxelles. It's a real pleasure and a real honor to see you all here to attend this first EU-EA conference that will be devoted this year, 2017, to controversial approaches of European solidarity. And I must say that the pleasure is all the more important as this conference was organized in very close cooperation, very close collaboration with two partners. First partner is the IES, so the Instituut voor Europese Studie of our sister university, so Vrije Universiteit Brussels. But also another key partner in this project is the H2020 research project called ENLIGHTEN that is coordinated by the Copenhagen Business School. During this two-day conference, we'll have also 5 other H2020 research projects that will be represented, namely the Koch project, the Corplink project, the Gemstone project, the Reinvest project, and the LSIT project. Special thanks are due to the Jean Monnet program, as this conference is part of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence project that was awarded to this Institut d'études européennes. And we are, of course, also particularly grateful to our two main partners I already mentioned. And I would like here especially to express our gratitude to the president of the IES, Carole de Gucht, who will be present with us tomorrow, Christian Karnert, Anthony Antoine, and Florian Trauner. I would like also to express our deep gratitude, of course, to the ENLIGHTEN project and to its chief scientist, Professor Lennart Seabrook from the Copenhagen Business School. I would also like to thank all our collaborators here at the Institute for European Studies of the ULB for helping us make this event a reality. And first on my list is, of course, Professor Ramona Coman, the director of this institute, but also Johan Robrecht, our executive director for research, and Frédéric Pugnart. I would like also to thank particularly Maria Isabel Soldevilla, who is our executive manager and responsible for public relations and communication. And I would like finally to thank also Michela Arcarese, Pierre Virosé, Mathieu Bogarts, Françoise van den Broek, Dominique Dambourg, and Frédéric Laplume. So thank you very much to all of you for your precious collaboration in this project. We wish you, of course, all a very fruitful conference full of interdisciplinary and topical debates and discussion. And I immediately give the floor to the chair of this opening keynote session, Professor Laporte. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to welcome Vivien Schmidt and Mark Schwartz. So Vivien from Boston University and Mark from University of Virginia. And if I know Vivien well, she will enlighten us, even if it's been a long day. She'll manage to provoke a debate on the topic of welfare states and the impact of the Eurozone crisis with the perspective of solidarity. You have about 20 minutes, and then Mark, you have about 10 minutes to comment, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion.
Thank you. So delighted to be able to do this. Also worried that I'm the only thing between you and drinks. after this, so I will try to keep my remarks as brief as I can. The long version of the title of my talk is Varieties of Welfare States Over Time and the Impact of the Eurozone Crisis, with a specific focus on what it means for social solidarity. So I thought what I would do is do sort of first a general introduction into how we can think about this. Then I want to do a very brief history of the welfare state, very brief of course, just to remind you of what's happened since the 1980s, followed by the strains on the welfare state caused by the Eurozone crisis, and in particular the problems regarding structural reform in the European semester, etc. So for the introduction, for years, most scholarly discussion of the European welfare states was separated from the discussion of European political economies, as well as party politics and democracy. Very different ways of looking at things. So for the welfare state, it was generally described in terms of families of welfare states, 3 or 4, liberal Anglophone, social democratic Scandinavian, conservative continental Europe, with France as an exception, and sometimes Mediterranean states seen as a 4th variety. But there were always, everyone talked about 4 varieties, whereas of families of welfare states. Whereas in political economists, very differently, you had those who argued that there's really only one model of neoliberal convergence. They were opposed by those who said there are at least 2, or that there are only 2 varieties of capitalism. Liberal market economies on the one hand, Anglophone basically, versus coordinated market economies, mainly Nordic and continental Europe. And then there were those who said, wait a minute, amongst them me, among other people who said there are at least 3 varieties of capitalism, that the problem with the sort of the convergence people is they assume they focus mainly on financial markets and that, whereas the problem with the varieties of capitalism too is that they focus primarily on firms. Maybe they talk about labor markets, but really as a sideshow. They never mention the state, whereas for those of us who said there were at least 3 varieties, I argued there's at least something called state-influenced market economies, that you can't leave out the state. But then there are others, Robert Boyer, Bruno Amable, and others who say, wait a minute, we need to go beyond that. So how many varieties are there? That remains a continual debate up until today. But so you had the welfare state specialists speaking to one another, the political economy people speaking to themselves, or to one another, or themselves, and then the political specialists essentially, basically didn't talk to the other two. They never looked at welfare states or political economy, and they're mostly focused on democracy, mainstream parties, and they never questioned any of this. It's always mainstream party politics with mass parties around a left-right divide. And today, what we realize is you can't keep these 3 separated. They are increasingly interconnected, inextricably interlinked, and all increasingly problematic. The macroeconomic problems, in particular for the EU, focused on slow growth and the risk of deflation, feed into the microeconomic problems of low private investment, fewer and fewer productivity gains, and then, of course, there are all the socioeconomic problems of the people who feel left behind, precarious unemployment, high rates of unemployment in some countries, especially youth, rising poverty, inequality. And then there's the crisis of democracy. And there's the rise of populism that focuses on all of this, plus a whole range of other problems. You can talk about the sociocultural, identity politics, but we also need to mention just the political mistrust, the rise of political mistrust in the rise of populism and anti-Euro, anti-EU, anti-immigrant feeling. And all of this is now inextricably bound together which makes our lives very, very complicated. We all now have to talk to one another. We being welfare specialists, political economists, and politics specialists, because it's all so much now interlinked. So we have to ask, why has there been such a shift? You know, why have things become so unstuck? And we've got to look back to the policies of the 1980s. So it is primarily about neoliberal reforms, whether you like them or not, whether you say, of course, the 1970s was stagnation, problematic, something needed to be done, and neoliberalism is what came in. It begins things, and it does create a shift. But what we see is a shift over time. There's first a focus on monetary policy, macroeconomics. This is mainly the 1980s. Shift to independent central banks, the reduction in capital controls, increasing openness to globalization, open borders. But then you see that it shifts over by the late 80s into the 90s. It turns to microeconomic policies. It's about firms. It's about privatization and deregulation. And then, of course, it moves on, even though in some countries it started already in the 80s, like the UK, it moves to the deregulation of labor markets and the rationalization of social policy. And of course, EU policies have been promoting and supporting such moves. In particular, beginning in the 2000s with the move to the euro and the assumption that European economies need to converge. Then, of course, we get the Eurozone crisis, and we get much more forceful push on all of these kinds of changes, because it's about reinforcing stability through what I've called governing by rules and ruling by numbers. And that's about pushing austerity and structural reform. And this is highly problematic. But what we can say is, although he's governing by rules and ruling by numbers, there's a recognition, and this is, talk about in the fast-burning phase of the crisis, you get a doubling down on the rules. But as the crisis slows, following Draghi's promise to do whatever, or threat to do whatever it takes, the crisis starts slowing, and EU institutional actors recognize that there is something that they can do. And they recognize and this is the legitimacy stuff, as output legitimacy fails, as economies deteriorate, and input legitimacy also deteriorates, i.e. increasing political volatility, the throughput legitimacy of governing by rules and ruling by numbers shifts, and they recognize, okay, we've got to change the rules. But what you see is they end up reinterpreting the rules by stealth. That is, they say, hey guys, we're following the rules, don't worry. But in fact, they are worried, and they're altering the rules. Increasing flexibility from the Commission, the Council goes from saying austerity to saying, well, actually, okay, growth, and then flexibility, and then investment. And at the same time, the ECB, of course, moves to hero of the crisis, reinterprets its mandate radically over time, but slowly, from a credibility discourse to a stability medium-term discourse, which enables it ultimately to do quantitative easing. These are massive shifts, and yet there's a discourse saying we're doing what we've always done. This is all about, and so problematic. Problematic in terms of legitimacy, because the rules remain suboptimal, the policies are not very effective, and there are continued concerns about accountability and transparency. Political legitimacy is in question, and European solidarity in particular, since I'm supposed to talk about European social solidarity, that is the loser. But I think it's important to note that even before the Eurozone crisis, the welfare state was under tremendous pressure. And here, it's not just Europeanization. We've got to blame globalization, the shift of production to developing countries, increased capital mobility, pressures from immigration and emigration. We've heard about the brain drain earlier. We could also blame globalization in one region, that is the EU, that promoted much more neoliberal reform and openness than you might have necessarily seen elsewhere. But beyond that, we can also blame technological changes, automation, that explains some of the reasons for people who end up being left behind. But there's also, of course, neoliberal ideas about how to confront the challenges of the future. And we have to ask, could there have been another way with more social solidarity all along? But that didn't happen. So if we look at the history, and I realize I've talked much longer than I expected as my general introduction, so I'm just going to do bullet points to remind you of the history. When Herman, now Mark, when we first met, when we did our welfare and work in the open economy, which I co-edited with Fritz Scharf, and Herman was one of the numbers of people in the project, we identified 3 challenges for the different varieties. So for Anglophone countries, for liberal welfare states, it was work without welfare. For Scandinavian countries with universalist systems, it was which had work and welfare. The problem was, could it be sustainable at such a high level? And of course, for continental Europe in particular, it was welfare without work. And how do you deal with high levels of unemployment, et cetera? And there's more to that, but we'll leave that. When I wrote my book on the futures of European capitalism in 2002, looking at European political economies, what we saw in the UK, what I saw in the UK was radical reform, macro and micro, and a strong discourse of legitimation while doing it. Thatcher basically said, here's what we're doing, and here's what why we're doing it. Get on your bikes, it's about individualism, it's Victorian values, etc. And she legitimated. And people, ultimately began to, their lives had changed. And therefore they began to believe what she argued about that. In France, what you got was actually also a lot of neoliberal change, but a discourse that basically said, there's not neoliberalism, it's modernization. And don't worry, it's all about social solidarity. And of course, social solidarity was being destroyed over time, but the discourse was, don't worry, be happy, we're still solidaire, and we're just modernizing. But obviously, it was all about neoliberal reform. Germany was interesting because in 2002, nothing had changed. And I write a book, and I say, okay, Germany's the case where, it remains stable. And then, of course, within a couple years, Hartz IV reforms, and it all changes. And I think the Hartz IV reforms are really important because that, I think, is also the key to what happens in the Eurozone crisis. Wrong lessons learned, what happens in 2004, 5, et cetera, is France following Germany says, we're not going to follow the Stability and Growth Pact rules because, hey, we're in a recession. This doesn't work. We need to spend. And they changed the rules, the French and the Germans. And it actually is very helpful because the Hartz IV reforms would never go through without more expansionary macroeconomic policies, even as they destroy property rights in terms of pension rights. And don't provide a legitimating discourse for it either, which means it's always highly problematic. But at the same time, okay. I saw 1 minute, I thought, no. Five. Okay. But I think what's important there is that there are 2 things. These reforms, highly problematic in terms of social solidarity, because it opens things up for Germany for mini jobs and all the rest. The dualization of the workforce of a very radical kind, so much so that I'm told that some of the salaries are lower than in Southern Europe, where you also have tremendous dualization, temporary and part-time work. So that the question becomes, for Germany, is it really that its success is due to its high value-added manufacturing and export, or is it due to how little it's paying people in these low-paying service jobs? I think that's important. But so the Hartz-IV reforms radically, basically, decentralizes one part of the labor market, because we also have to remember that social protections remain, that sort of labor protection, et cetera, and you still have, for the manufacturing sector, corporatism, if you will, but it's only one small part. So what happens with the Eurozone crisis? What's highly problematic? Wrong lessons learned all around. The wrong lessons learned are, one, Hartz-IV reform is great and everyone should do it because that is the root of success. Number two, that Germany should never have given up on the Stability and Growth Pact, and that we need to reinforce the rules. Wait a minute. No one took the lesson that it was expansive economies that can get labor to agree to such reforms. Okay. Moving right along. Okay, but then finally the Eurozone crisis and what the problem is and its impact on the welfare state and on European solidarity. You know, when we talk about what happened in the EU, we generally talk about non-program countries. So that's what I'm going to do. But we need to remember that for the program countries, the countries under conditionality, for the pigs, you notice I have a C on the end, pigs, or the gypsies, all politically very incorrect in terms of the terms, but anyway, and for the Central and Eastern European countries under the conditionality of the IMF and the EU starting in 2008-9, highly problematic in terms of the, the destruction of social solidarity and welfare states in most cases that were only just beginning to come up to the norm. But forget about them. Just look at non-program countries, equally problematic. And who do we blame? Germany. But the question is, how do you, how do we blame Germany? Is it because of its coercive power? Economic weight? Or maybe coercive power over ideas? Or persuasive power? I mean, the thing that's problematic about this is that everyone agreed. In an earlier panel, the question was, why did they agree? Is it, I think Cornell asked that question, is it about ideology? Is it about politics? These were conservative governments. Or is it, again, about sort of everyone buys into a misdiagnosis of the crisis, misframing the crisis as caused by public debt, misdiagnosis as bad behavior, without adequate remedies, no solutions, but there were solutions floating around, Eurobonds, EMF, discussion of a European Monetary Fund, banking union that does come, but without a real sufficient backstop. Still no individual deposit insurance. People are talking about unemployment insurance, but none of this happens. And then if we look at what happens with austerity and structural reform, and that's really the sort of the constant theme throughout this period, and certainly in the fast-burning part of the crisis, it's focused on austerity. But even when that lets up, you've still got structural reform, and it's highly problematic in all the ways that lots of people have already talked about. But I just want to add one thing. So what's wrong with structural reform? It's actually, nothing's wrong with structural reform per se. It's its neoliberal bias. And it's what it's done to undermine existing labor markets and welfare states. But we've got to ask why the privileging of structural reform of a neoliberal kind. Is it just ideology? No. There's a lot of ideology there. But it's because there was an assumption that these are the only policies that could combat the structural problems at the basis of the Eurozone. What's ironic here, and this Veltraud Sheikley in a recent book, in a book that just came out, really makes this point. What's really ironic is the ECB, is the Council, et cetera, go forward with the euro, despite OCA, optimum currency area economists, saying you can't do this because it's either going to fall apart or you have to go into deep fiscal federalism. And they ignore all of that at the same time that they take on what the OCA economists argue is the only way in which you can do anything, which is to make this convergent, is to increase the flexibility of labor markets and rationalize welfare states. And so in order to promote convergence, they take on the OCA assumptions, neoliberal assumptions, despite the fact that they've argued that they've assumed that OCA doesn't apply. Highly, highly problematic. And we've seen the results in terms of really crushing labor market, crushing labor unions, et cetera. And what's highly problematic about this as well, going back to the German assumptions, is that what this means is for countries, for non-program countries, but even more so for program countries, what this means is you apply the labor market flexibility, the dualization of the workforce, or actually it's a singularization, because you're creating low wage across the board at the same time. So you're creating the German service market economy basically throughout, and forgetting that Germany has another economy that is alleged, another part of the economy that is alleged to have solved, to be the solution for everyone, which is strong export, high value added manufacturing and growth that has highly protected labor markets with good working conditions and high wages. And yet what you're imposing on program countries in particular, but also non-program countries, is a deregulation of the labor markets that actually will make it impossible for those countries to succeed in the way Germany has, if that is indeed the way forward. So I'm almost out of time. We're totally out of time. So just one last thought, which is, I haven't said anything about politics. And just to conclude there, with the rise of populism, this is all highly problematic. Because what we've done is taken out the underpinnings that have, Katzenstein, small countries, small states in open economies. Basically, we have created the EU as to one big open economy without the kinds of protections that make it, that ensure that people accept this. And maybe I better stop. I'll go on after.
Thank you very much, Vivien. Okay, Mark, you will continue to enlighten us?
I will be extremely short because it's also my dinner that I'm in my own way of, which matters a lot to me because I'm not sure I'm completely solidaristic with you, as most of you are Europeans and I'm an American. I'll start off by saying I'm the last person to defend the Germans, except maybe for Valtraud Schelkel. She's pretty nice. And I'll also say that if you thought Vivien was a bit pessimistic, I would say I'm even more so. And when I ran the graduate program at University of Virginia, I was known as by the students, I was known as the Prince of Darkness. So don't expect cheerful thoughts, but of course then you get to go eat, and that will make you happy. And I'm going to finish Vivien's talk for her because I want to mostly talk about politics, but I don't want to talk about politics in terms of the literature so much because I'm a very lazy person. I don't keep up with the literature. I try not to read political scientists. But once upon a time, I did read Emile Durkheim, in English anyway, so I have some vague understanding. I'm sure it's better in the French. And Durkheim, you'll recall, made a big distinction between mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. But since it's been years since you've all read that, I'll just say, of course, mechanical solidarity, the words are bad, at least in English. Mechanical solidarity is founded on true emotional ties. And organic solidarity actually is based on a cool, rational appreciation of one's place in the division of labor and one's reliance on other people in that division of labor. And that's of course, the way most of us think about welfare states. We think of them as being based on organic, i.e. rational considerations about risk and the management of risk in our lives. And that's, of course, completely wrong, and it's wrong for two reasons. Reason number one is that elites, in fact, are not solidaristic with any of us. And if I were to summarize what Vivien said in one sentence, it's that from the 1980s forward, and not just from 2008 forward or 2006 forward, elites have abandoned the masses. And consequently, in self-defense, the masses, such as they are, have responded emotionally, and emotionally in two ways. And the first way, of course, is that they have responded the way they have always responded to efforts by elites to radically constrain their consumption or force them into production patterns they don't like, and that is to riot. And the populist movements of today don't look like riots the way we think of riots, especially in the US, where they tend to involve burning things down. They're more middle-class, restrained riots, but they're riots at the ballot box. And I will certainly remind everybody that Trump did not win the majority of votes, but nonetheless, to the extent that Trump is president today, and to the extent that that was not a matter of Russian election manipulation and hacking of voting machines and all that, it represents a riot by people who felt excluded. And much the same is true in Europe today, regardless of what label you want to put on parties like Sweden Democracy or Danish People's Party. These are riots, and they're driven by a sense of abandonment by elites. And they're driven by emotional considerations. They're driven by considerations of what Durkheim called mechanical solidarity. They're not based on cool considerations of, right, okay, the Reichsrente, yeah, okay, maybe I need to save a little bit more. I'll just go check my bank balance and make a calculation about what a bailout of the banks might mean for that and a bailout of the southern countries might mean for that. There's no cool calculation around any of this. It's all emotional. And so if I can turn to the second thing that I know, which is movies, not the literature. So we're done with the literature, that's Durkheim. Now to the movies. Some of you might be old enough to remember Metropolis, Fritz Lang? Okay. Only the two people with gray hair in the audience and me. Who? You don't remember it. Okay, it's the
1980s with a soundtrack.
It was reissued with an interesting, sometimes horrible soundtrack by Sergei the Murderer. Fritz Lang, 1927. So we're 90th anniversary this year. Of this movie. I mean, the shortest possible summary of the movie, for those of you who haven't seen it, is that it's about riots of the oppressed working class against elites that have abandoned them. That's why I'm talking about it. The movie ends, 1927, the movie ends with management shaking hands with the working class, mediated by a skilled laborer, represented by a skilled laborer, and mediated by the son of management. And the text, because it's a black and white silence movie, the text after that handshake, which is the class compromise between management and labor, says between the head, that's management, and the hand, labor, is the heart. And that's why it's not organic solidarity, as Durkheim puts it. It's mechanical solidarity. There has to be some sense of emotional ties. Those are gone. That's what the 1980s and forward did. And what is spurring these riots today is, in fact, I think, an effort to recreate mechanical solidarity. And it's, of course, a bit perverse because it's an emotional reaction. These are ethno-nationalist riots, and that's the one thing I think was really missing from what you had to say, and so that's why I'm putting it in here. These are ethno-nationalist riots. They are riots against the others, and mostly, right, the dark others from those places that we don't like, or those dark others in America that we've never been able to get rid of since we made that mistake of bringing them as slaves. They're also, of course, against elites who are not part of our community. And the reference here, if you want your movie reference here, is 300. I'm sorry to bore those who heard this little bit, which came up in question and answer before, but if you think about the movie 300, probably even fewer of you have seen this. It's a decidedly lowbrow movie, but if you really want to understand Trumpism in America, and I'm willing to bet, to a certain extent, the equivalence in Europe, you should go watch this movie. Again, the shortest possible description of this movie is a white, rural, family-oriented society besieged from without by dark, metrosexual, pierced, tattooed, Asiatic, ill-behaved outsiders. And here's the critical thing. Don't worry. Here's the critical thing. Just like in Metropolis, what happens when the riots occur? The working class destroys itself along with the elites. In Metropolis, the working class goes out and destroys the pumps that keep the water out of its own underground city. And the same thing is true in a slightly different way in the 300 movie, which is about the Spartans at Thermopylae. It's what the story comes from. They're going out to die. They know they're going to die anyway, but they're defending their understanding of what a normal society is from those outsiders, and they're willing to die over it. So the crisis of solidarity in the US, the crisis of solidarity in much of Europe, and the errors about understanding solidarity in the political science literature come from thinking about solidarity in Durkheim's organic solidarity terms. It's not a rational calculation. It is ultimately, and here's where I finally, 20 years later, come around to Vivien Schmidt's position. It is about an emotional identity. It's about an emotional attachment to community and an idea of community. And that idea of community is gone. And that's why we have these ethno-nationalist riots. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take some questions. I think we'll collect some and then let Vivien answer. Jenny?
I have three questions, and maybe it's a bit daring because I'm not really part totally of this community. I'm not part of your research project. But three questions and three remarks. First, Vivien, and that's the case for all political economists, of course, you describe us a very well-informed and detailed story of what had happened in the last 15 years. But it is a stifling reality, the way it's presented, because in a way then the question I ask is, it's all based on the power of ideas, or many of your analyses are based on the group of the power of ideas. As a sociologist, I would think it would be very useful, and maybe even more, or at least from a proof perspective, to look at the lobbies behind these ideas, how they have evolved. Who are they? Can you make a cartography of them? Can you describe the alliances between them, the way they have evolved in the last 15 years with the ideas which are pinpoint? What are the concrete relationships with governments? From a sociological point of view, this would be more convincing than going on saying the powerful ideas on neoliberalism and so on and so forth, and then the link with austerity policy. First remark. Second remark is a question. Do you believe in correction mechanisms possible with these wild or less wild neoliberal trends we're experiencing? Do these correction mechanisms strengthen neoliberalism? And would you say Macron's policy, for instance, is in such a situation? Question. Third question, that's different, completely different order of question. Do you think that neoliberalism has swallowed all, like a whale, all member states? I mean, if you look at the Nordic countries, and you rarely speak about them when I hear you speaking, of course they have been the first to liberalize. Sweden, Denmark on economic issues like transports, public telecom, all this. So they are highly liberalized countries. But on the other hand, they managed to safeguard their welfare systems to a large extent, despite, of course, activation and so on, and cost reduction and so on. So what would you say, how does your story fit for, does it fit so well for Nordic countries? This is my question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vivien, for an interesting, inspiring talk. I do want to push you a little bit on optimum currency area theory and this, the labor markets that have to be flexibilized. Today, the new country-specific recommendations came out, and if you have a look at them, I mean, the Netherlands, increase your wages, fight dualization, increase the uptake of open-ended contracts. France, increase the uptake of open-ended contracts. Spain, incentivize hiring on open-ended contracts. Italy, strengthen your collective bargaining. So, I don't know if it still reflects the reality of 2017.
Okay, and then we'll take 2 questions over here. Yeah, I know, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for 2 wonderful talks. I have a question to Mark, and that's maybe also that would be interesting for Vivien, which is, if the analysis is correct that elites have abandoned the masses, then what was the glue that kept these elites and these masses together before? Was it really the Second World War? Was it that, or what was it in your perspective? Basically pushing you a bit more on Durkheim here. Thank you.
Okay, and then we have one in the back of the room, and then we'll take you, and then we...
I was suffering a bit, Professor Schmidt, I should say, not only because I'm a German citizen, but also from an academic perspective, I should say. I had the impression you glorify the welfare state's achievements, as if we had the paradise situation until 1990 and just caused chaos afterwards. I think that's not fair. We should consider, for instance, that my parents still could not really enjoy generous welfare and health insurance and pension funds as my generation does. We have an aging population, so we have people getting older, we have less young people, we have skyrocketing medical costs, and I wonder how the tools of the 70s, 80s could cope with these challenges that we have without blaming certain governments. So that's my first point. The second point is, I was wondering, as you described the euro problems in a way with a strong Germany and the weak others, what about corruption in the PIGS countries? What about tax evasion by those people who refuse to pay taxes? Because I had the impression welfare systems also need to live on their own, not only on the cost of others. So that's always difficult to run this discussion in Germany. And the third point is, you said at the very beginning, I found in a too negative way that the European Union does not deliver in its policies here and there, and I would challenge that. The European Union, with its free flow of work, labor, for instance, offers so many job opportunities for people from the poorer countries, in particular Central and Eastern Europe, that can move freely to other countries where there are stronger economies to benefit from that. And that is the last point I wanted to raise. The massive economic consequences that the end of the Cold War had on the European continent is nothing that we can simply neglect or overlook. There were so massive costs that had to be covered by the whole European continent or the European Union that I think this is something really where we can be more positive. The Euro crisis 2008 cannot be compared with the global crisis in 1929. And that's my last sentence, what we face now with the Ukraine crisis, for instance, I'm quite sure until the 1990s, this would have led to another serious war. And I'm so glad to say that thanks to the European cooperation, we have so much improvements that I was missing in your presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And then we'll take one last question or comment.
Yeah, very, very quick one. So first of all, thank you very much for the papers. I think the revolt of the elites, which you referred to, the revolt of the elites goes back. I mean, Christopher Lasch was writing about this in the 1970s and 1980s, and very persuasively so. I think they never accepted the welfare state. They started their kickback immediately. What puzzled me about the European Union, as someone who studied tax havens and offshore, was the degree to which the European Union was prepared to allow these Trojan horses, particularly the UK, to operate in the way that they have, right the way through, knowing full well it was going to end in tears. And that was almost inevitable, and I'd like to have some comment on that, please.
Okay, thanks for all those great and very provocative questions and a lot of debate. Vivien?
Okay. Yeah, there's always a problem when one has very little time to discuss, and and my remit was to talk about the problems, the impact on the welfare state of the kinds of changes. But just to say something to Herman, I mean, I think we could use Polanyi here as well, to talk about this is the moment of the counter movement. And if we remember, Polanyi is talking about a counter movement. And he's not thinking about the post-war. He's looking at the rise of fascism and Nazism as a counter movement. And so I think that sort of continues. I think just to say something about the importance of ideas and discourse, a lot of this has been going on a long time. We've seen the rise of anti-immigration stuff going on since the 2000s. So on the importance of ideas and discourse, why now? Why in this way? And it has a lot to do with new kinds of populist leaders who have been able to reshape the political landscape by framing the debates in new ways, new social media. I mean, there's a whole reason why you could argue that it's now, and there are ideational sources for this. I would say, yes, it's about the sociocultural politics of identity and the other, et cetera, but it's also about neoliberalism gone too far. Which you would agree with, and the socioeconomic problems of inequality and insecurity, also recognizing that things have gotten a lot better for a lot of people, but the Eurozone crisis has made things worse again for a whole range of people. Certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, I mean, think about Latvia, but you can also look at the impact on welfare states with massive cuts that had to do with, I mean, you blame the EU Commission if you don't want to blame Germany, or blame something that we could call the Brussels-Frankfurt consensus. Blame, before that, the Washington consensus, and a whole assumption about the way you engage in reform. All of these, I think, we could mention, but Janine asked me about Macron. I would add Macron and Theresa May. What's really interesting now is something new is happening. All of a sudden, it may very well be that elites have awakened to the problems as mainstream parties fall apart in France, or as in the UK, Brexit, shooting oneself in the head. But what you get with Theresa May's program is all of a sudden it sounds like post-war social democracy program in terms of decent wages. I think it's $8 billion she's promised to the National Health Service over the next 5 years, a whole range of things that doesn't sound conservative. And she says, basically, she's against the radical right of her own conservative party. That's significant. And Macron seems to be doing a little bit of the right and a little bit of the left. balanced, and he is engaging in structural reform. Nothing wrong with structural reform as long as it's the right kind. So I perfectly will agree with you that issues of corruption need to be addressed, issues of taxation. That's the right kind of structural reform. The problem of what we've seen, and I'm not going to necessarily blame anyone here, but if you look at what happened, in the European semester, the headline goal number 1 was fiscal consolidation. Number 2 was structural reform. 2011, that recommendation is crush the unions. By 2014, it's do whatever you can, be nice to the social partners. And by now, of course, it's what we've seen in recent reports. This suggests that, in fact, there has been a reinterpretation of the rules over time. In the fast-burning crisis, if you will, there was a doubling down on the rules and austerity of a pretty negative kind. But do we blame the EU, or do we actually blame national leaders who are worried, in some cases, about what the markets are going to say, and have also taken the easy way out in some ways? Easier to cut across the board, rather than saying, okay, now we need to think about social justice. We need to get rid of our clientelistic groups, but we also have to deal with the fact that for program countries, in particular for Greece, what you're dealing with a state that doesn't work. And that when you impose these kinds of pressures, there's not the strength to say, okay, let's fix our problems. And instead what you do is you double down and you cause more problems for these countries. And it is the crisis. It is a crisis in which you're seeing the rise of the masses. But it's not only the people who feel hurt by this, it's also in Northern Europe. It is a socio-cultural thing. We need to defend our welfare states against immigrants. That's Denmark, and it's been going on since the early 2000s. But it's also Sweden. It's also Finland now. So the question is, how do you respond? And also with the Eurozone crisis, it's a question of how you respond. So I think I'll finish this response by using a metaphor that I developed. I was in Lisbon in October at a big conference on democracy, and on the panel I was matched with Wolfgang Streeck. So even more depressing than you. Because for him, the euro was a disaster, and it was all going to end in tears. Everything was going to explode. And I said to him, Wolfgang, I generally agree with your analysis, the economic analysis, etc. But your vision is of a locomotive going 300 kilometers per hour straight into the station, and there's nothing we can do. There's a structural explanation. It's going to all blow apart. Whereas I see the conductor on the train starting to try to apply the brakes, whichever way he can, looking for a sidetrack in order to go. And in my view, this is about the reinterpretation of the rules. This is a recognition. This is also about the problem of a EU governance system that is very hard to change. Once you say we're going to do this, how do you change it? But what we're seeing is a sort of a gradual, incremental attempt to move forward. And we're seeing a softening. I mean, absolutely. We're seeing a recognition. This is not working. This is not legitimate. We are now in danger, and I think everyone's waking up to this. We are in danger of it all going to pieces. I'm reading Sinclair Lewis's 1935, It Can't Happen Here. And what's really frightening is all of the same themes that we saw and some of the similar kinds of arguments or, populist rhetoric that you saw in Trump is right there in 1935 in this novel. The only difference is, well, it's what you said in the movie. The blacks are the ones who are completely disenfranchised and they have to go back to being domestics. We didn't see that in Trump's rhetoric. But aside from that, well, I guess switch to Mexicans. So I think that there's a recognition that we're in a very dangerous place. And I think we are too. But I'm hoping that we're going to find that side view and that maybe finally we'll pick up steam. We will return to a recognition that elites need to reconnect with the masses in some ways. But if not, we have to decide where we're moving.
Thank you. On that bright note, Mark, a couple of quick thoughts.
One paragraph. The shortest possible answer, since we're out of time, is yeah, it's the Second World War made a huge difference. The Cold War made a huge difference. The Depression made a huge difference. And the difference is, and this is the connection to the other question to me, when we talk about elites, we tend to think about elites as being unified, but they're not. There are always conflicts among elites, and also there's disagreements among elites about what is the precise rate of exploitation that is possible. And some are content to have a sustainable harvest, and others are not. And when my child, my older child was maybe 3 or 4 years old, she was actually in the famous marshmallow experiment that was done in the US, where they put the child in a room by themselves with a bowl, a couple marshmallows, and they say, if you don't eat them, if you wait, you'll get 4 instead of the 2, right? And so some elites are like, okay, that's right, we can be rational about this, I'm gonna have double my rate of return if I don't eat these marshmallows right now. And other elites are like, oh, well, you can eat these 2 marshmallows, and then I'll steal 2 more from the person when they come in. I'll just grab it out of their hands. And in the U.S., I don't know this about Europe, but in the U.S., the second group of elites, yes, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, start a project to damp down the overly strong democracy of the time. And this, if you know your Samuel Huntington, this is Samuel Huntington, the OECD McCracken report is all about too much demand from the masses, time to push them down a little bit. But it takes a long time to get that into those ideas into the heads of enough people at the top for them to go over the edge. And just not to personalize this too much, but to give you a sense of what this really means in real life. You guys know the Koch brothers, right? Yeah. Okay, the Koch brothers were willing to give me, not research grant, just give me as a reward for coming to Libertarian Summer Camp, $10,000 US. So if they're willing to give me $10,000 US, what about the people that really matter? And remember, those people that really matter, they're motivated by money, right? They're not academics. But also, I mean, academics may be a little bit motivated by money. So, I mean, it takes a long time for that corrosive force to change what's going on in people's heads and move them to a position of, yeah, we can eat those 2 marshmallows right now. The generation that knows you can't eat the 2 marshmallows right now disappears. The new generation comes in. And then you've got the problems we have today.
Okay, thank you very much.